All statements and opinions expressed by guests of this podcast are not representative of the Orthochat, its host, or its producers, and should not be associated with the podcast unless explicitly stated by the host.
You are listening to the Orthochat by Yanni Katsadas.
Σιγαργατάκησε όλος τη αμαρτία και παρεδόθης τελείως τη ραθυμία της εξαναστήσης σε κείμενο.
Κύριε Ιησού Χριστέ ελέησον, 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 Κύριε Ιησού Χριστέ ελέησον. Hi everyone, Uncle John here with the Orthochat. Quick disclaimer before this episode begins. We were having some technical difficulties, so there was no video on this interview with Father Seraphim. Also, we couldn't get the software that we used to record these to work, so this was actually over the phone with me putting it up to my microphone, and it still came out nice. It's still going to sound perfectly fine, but there is no video. And also, I believe I mentioned in the episode that Father Philip Kontos is going to be on the episode that we will post tomorrow, but this will not be the case since he is currently sick. We will give him a call next week to see when he's recovered, and then we will reschedule with him. But we will replace that episode tomorrow with continued reading of Wounded by Love, and just enjoy this episode, and God willingly, you guys will find it spiritually fulfilling, so God be with you, and get ready for this. Greetings in Christ, brothers and sisters. Welcome to interview 3 of the Orthochat, and due to some technical difficulties, we're going to be doing this one over the phone with Father Seraphim. And Father, how are you? You're hearing us all right?
Yes, I can hear you fine. Thank you.
All right, thank God. You want to start us off with a prayer?
Sure, I'd be glad to. In the name of Father, Son, Holy Spirit. Oh Lord, in these moments, help us to hear and be heard. In the name of the Father, Son, Holy Spirit. Amen.
Amen. Lovely. So, we're going to get through some of what I wanted to ask you, but before I ask you that, how was your week so far, at least?
I have to think. It's been good.
Good.
It's been a good week. Thank you.
Thank God. And this is the first time that we're talking kind of in depth, because the first time I was referenced to you was when I was at Geneva, and one of my Protestant professors there referenced me to you because I was the only Orthodox Christian there at the time, and I remember me and you had a phone call for the first time maybe 2 years ago.
That sounds about right.
Yeah. So, we're gonna kind of work from the bottom up here, and the first thing I wanted to go over with you was, what was your experience growing up as a boy in Protestantism?
Well, I grew up in a conservative Protestant home. We were a family of 6 with an income of $5,000 a year. And translated, that means we were poor. We had hand-me-down clothes, hand-me-down cars. We walked to church. And to get to my church, I walked past my elementary school. But my mother had a basic rule, which was if you go out Saturday night, you have to get up for church Sunday morning. So
I got that one too.
Okay.
Yeah, that's
And but I spent my early years going to Sunday school, and I think I memorized a few things, and I think all the way through, I went through Sunday school. I was in our youth group in the church. And so it was a fairly small church in a small community of 5,000 people west of Pittsburgh. And so that was life at that time.
Okay, yeah. And so you've pretty much been operating in the same area for your entire life, west of Pittsburgh, and that's like kind of around where the college is as well, right?
Yeah, as they say, I'm a Western Pennsylvania person.
Yeah, I'm right there with you. So at what point during your youth did you realize you wanted to pursue being a pastor? Like, what was that moment like?
Well, this is, I have a list of these kind of stories. I mean, truly God moments, but I was offered, I did well enough in school that my chemistry teacher wanted me to apply for a government program at the University of Pittsburgh, where in 5 years I would study and work for the government and get a dual degree in civil and mining engineering. And so I started by working my first, what was called back then a trimester, working with the Bureau of Mines in Oakland. And then I would start school the next trimester.
Okay.
Well, the trimester wasn't going very well. And the harder I studied, the harder I worked, the worse I did. So it was pretty depressing, and I actually was getting depressed. And one day I was sitting on my front porch, which actually would become a very holy place. It was the porch where the four of us kids would always help my father paint. It's the porch from where I learned to spit. And I was sitting on that porch, and I asked myself, what do you want to do more than anything else for the rest of your life? And a voice so loud and clear came and said, you want to be a minister. And I actually looked to my left because I thought that's where the voice came from, but there was no one there, but I knew who it was.
Wow.
And so the next step was I need to get out of engineering and sign up for sociology. And now I'm working in a discount store stocking antifreeze for $3.75 an hour and going to school, taking 12 credits at a time, commuting from my home 5 miles west of Pittsburgh to the University of Pittsburgh. And I kept saying to God, Lord, is this really what you want me to do? And what happened was my phone rang, I think partway through that year, because I lost my job. And my old boss at the Bureau of Mines wanted me to come back because he got a grant, and I ended up working there for 4 years. And a total of 4 years. And so when I graduated from Pitt with an undergraduate in sociology, because that was the only thing that made sense to me at the time, and now I had planned to go to seminary after that. I graduated in August of that year, kind of late in the year, ready to start seminary in September, and I get a check in the mail for $1,500. Now, the part that I skipped was that Pitt was $1,400 a year tuition when I started. My father had to borrow money for me to get into my first year. And so I was working my way through school. And after the first year and a half that I was at Pitt, the tuition, they went state related, and the tuition went from $1,400 a year to $450 a year. And I was earning $350 a month with the Bureau of Mines once I was called back. In other words, I was pretty wealthy back in the 60s, to be honest. And so now it came time to graduate, and I get this check in the mail for $1,500. It's my retirement from the government, and back in those days, they didn't keep it like they do today.
Oh, okay. So it came right at the right time.
It came at the right time, and so now I'm probably one of the wealthiest incoming students at Pittsburgh Seminary in East Liberty of Pittsburgh. And one day, this is the next part of this story. One day after I move in, I get a notice in my box from the financial aid office and said, "Stop in and see us." And so the question was, "How do you expect to pay for this?" And I said, "Well, honestly, I hadn't thought that through yet."
I know the feeling.
All I knew was I was supposed to go to seminary.
Right.
And growing up Presbyterian, it made sense I should go to this seminary. And so there I am. I moved in, and I don't know what to do. And I get a call from my aunt, who's going to a church up the street from the seminary on Highland Avenue, maybe walking distance. And she invited me to come Sunday. And I go Sunday, and I meet the pastor, who I'd never met before. And he said to me, "I wanted to talk to you because we have a trust fund for members of the church that go to seminary." And he said, "I don't know how you feel about this, but I'd like to take your name because you're related to someone in our church who is my aunt, and take it to our board and ask about their permission to help you with this." And then he said something I'll never forget. He said, "We've had this trust fund for 40 years, and it's never been used."
Wow.
So now I'm waiting for word back, and I get a note in my mailbox within a week of being on campus. And basically it said, "Your way is paid," for 3 years. And I worked in the dining hall to make a few extra bucks. And the advantage was, in washing pots and pans, I could peruse the ice cream cooler and eat leftover desserts where I gained a lot of weight and then had to take it off later.
Right.
And graduated, I think, owing $100 to the seminary, which I took 6 months to pay off, I think.
Wow.
Back in those days. So I graduated from there in 1973. So that's the early part of my story. And by the way, in all that, I realized it was God at work, because I didn't do anything for any of that. And I just knew somehow I was driven toward going to seminary and graduating and going into the ministry.
Right. And so, you've experienced plenty of these small, well, not small, but these personally significant anecdotal blessings that kind of paved the way and carried you into what you would eventually become.
Yes, that's true.
Yeah. I mean, that's significant. I think there's a lot of people that could resonate with that, where they see, not miracles that are exactly, something as widespread and I guess capturing to everybody as like a weeping icon or like an incorrupt body, but these small miracles that occur in our lives are God directly coming into interaction with us, and it's really it's beautiful. It is.
Yes.
Now, something else I wanted to ask you concerning your experience in college. What was your experience, going to the universities amongst young people interested in Christ and amongst Protestants compared to what you see in Orthodox youth and young adults now?
Well, to be honest, I hated school.
Right.
I hated college. I kept looking up at the cathedral of learning, be out of here. It's the only thing I could think about was getting out of there.
Right.
But I had to graduate to get out of
Yeah.
there.
Mm-hmm.
And I was one of those students that just didn't like school. I just never did, and that would continue for some time. But even into seminary, it was almost similar that way. It wasn't I had terrible teachers, but I just, I thought school was boring. I thought so on and so forth.
Right. Well, I don't think you're alone in that. I think a lot of people that are in school just kind of want to get done. It's one of those things where it's kind of the means to an end rather than the
Right.
goal itself.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, in that time, I stayed connected to the church, and because I was commuting, I really didn't connect too much, except I worked for the University of Pittsburgh Student YMCA.
Okay.
And I actually would go with the director to Niagara Falls, taking international students every year. And he and I both would drive separate vans and go to Niagara Falls. And so he and I got to know each other quite well. And when he left, one of the last jobs I had in the final year, as I was finishing college, was to become the director of the Student Y, interim director at a young age of probably 21.
That's pretty cool.
Yeah, and it was, but I had to oversee a number of things, and I learned a lot from him. Hawaii to work at their YMCA, and he left me behind.
Right.
So it was an outreach ministry. I spent time volunteering on the north side of Pittsburgh, working with what back in the day we called gangs, and their worst offense was throwing eggs at cars and that kind of thing. But they had their own gang structure, as in president, vice president, secretary, and treasurer.
Right.
And then a gang always had an enforcer who was the one who would keep everybody in line when the president gave some word. So they were actually organized according to what I would read later as William White's Street Corner Society, a classic work on gangs. But they were junior high age.
Okay.
So as I said, their worst offense, I think, was throwing eggs at cars. But they didn't trust me, and I knew that. They had secret meetings, and I was supposed to tutor them, which I did after school. And one day they invited me into their meeting behind closed doors.
Mm-hmm.
And the president spoke up and said, "We want to talk to you." And he said, we have so he was real straight with me. He said, "We have a heist we want to pull off, but we don't have a way to haul the thing, so we need you to drive the car." So now I'm at the point where this is almost 6 months in, and I finally get their trust, and this is the request. And I am totally speechless and stuck. And then the president of the gang spoke up again and said, "Well, you're a Y guy. You might get in trouble, so never mind."
Right.
But I had accomplished trust with them, and I knew that. And so from there, things went better. But I felt badly because when I graduated from Pitt, as I said, in that August of that year, I had to go into seminary, and I could no longer be with them. And I always wanted to be what back in the day was called a street minister. I wanted to keep working with them. I remember saying, "I want to come back someday." And the closest I ever came was one day, and this is now very recent, several years ago. I would meet someone named Father Paul Abernathy.
Oh, I'm familiar with him.
Yes, and in the Hill District of Pittsburgh. And I was working with him at the time. And actually before that, I was working in Focus with him out of Beaver Falls, where my home parish is.
Right.
And but I was telling him this story one day when I was in his office in the Hill District. And so I was beginning to help with people who had gone through trauma. We started a trauma support group. And I was in his office. I was telling him this story about the gang work. And I said, I always promised him I'd come back. And he looked at me and said, "Well, you're back." You're back on
Yeah.
the streets
Mm-hmm.
of the poorer sections of Pittsburgh. I said, "You're right, Father." So, anyways, it's amazing, but these are things that stand out. But I always stayed, to go back to part of your question, I always stayed connected to my church as best I could. I actually ended up being a part-time custodian there. Actually was supported by the church when I was in seminary. And I would try to get home when I could to worship there. So that was an ongoing thing. And so that takes me now through 1973.
Oh, wow.
My graduation from Pittsburgh Seminary.
So the work that you were doing with I guess these youth and these gangs, it was comparably a lot more toned down to what most people think of when they hear the word gang, or like a group of young people like organizing, even on a vandalism level now or whatever.
Right. Yeah. They were gun-free gangs.
Okay.
The first gun back in those days in the 50s, do you know when it occurred in the movies? Other than war movies?
I do not.
It was in West Side Story.
Oh, okay.
Remember when the gun went off and somebody was killed? That was the first gunshot in any public movie other than the war movies of World War I and II.
Okay.
So that, these they were called gangs, and they called themselves gangs and so forth. But nothing compared at all to what we have today.
Yeah, right. No kidding.
It was more like an organized youth group that was going off course, in my thinking.
Right. I know exactly what you mean. Well, hopefully we can get back to something more peaceful like that one day. But So I mean, what else encapsulated your time as a pastor, kind of after you moved away from working with those kids, and then after you graduated seminary? What was it like in the beginning?
Well, I realized after all that, I did not want to become a pastor.
Okay.
And so I was trying to barter with God, and I wanted to go to medical school and become a medical missionary.
Right.
I thought a pastor was too lowly in some ways, and I wanted to do something that seemed different. And so I actually was sitting in the office of the dean of the Pitt Medical School with my transcripts in hand, and they weren't very good, by the way.
Well, that's okay.
For medical school purposes.
Right.
And so we had this conversation, which I'm having with you, and I noticed, by the way, that his father's name was on the board of our seminary at one point.
Yeah.
So I said, well, this might help, So I'm sitting there talking to him, and I was trying to, in a terrible way, build myself up when he said, your grades are pretty low, meaning they're not all A's. And I said, yes, I know. I said, I was working full-time and going to school full-time for over 4 years. And he said, the incoming students this year is 4.0. And that's when I came back and said, well, I was working full-time and going to school full-time in undergrad. And he looked at me and said, so were they.
Oh, well,
and I said, thank you for your time. I picked up my transcripts and went back, and I actually cried in my room. And I didn't know what to do next. So then I found out I was inspired by an eye doctor who was spending his time in Pakistan as a missionary. I met him at the New Wilmington Missionary Conference and was inspired by him, and they needed a chaplain in Pakistan as I was graduating from seminary. So keep in mind, this is like a detour through anything that I thought would ever happen.
Right, halfway across the world.
So I was accepted. I was accepted so much that I actually got the Student Missionary Award from Pittsburgh Seminary that year for $500
Oh, wow.
to help with the costs. And I was married in the same week I graduated.
There's a lot going on at once.
Well, I always told people that there was nothing going on the weekend, before my graduation, so I got married. And my wife and I met at the church where I served as an intern, seminary intern in my second year of seminary. And so we were engaged May 5th, 1973. I graduated a few days later, and we were getting ready to go to New York in August to interview for the work in Pakistan and get debriefed on the assignment. Well, we had to go to the consulate office and check on our passports, which were sent there. And we walked in, and there was a desk the size of, if you know what a railroad desk is, it's the kind that used to be in the railroad stations. They were huge, a huge desk. And the whole desk was covered with almost 2.5 feet high piles of passports.
Oh, my goodness.
And they're not alphabetized.
So they're just all over the place.
So he's trying to find ours, and there's just no way it's going to happen. I said, well, just send them to us when you find them, because we need these to get over to Pakistan. We need these visas.
Right.
Which will be coming back. Well, we get the visas back in the early fall of the year, sometime in September. And at the time, my wife had a 5-year-old son, so he gets a visa that's good for 3 months. We need to be there for a year. And my wife gets one good for 3 months, and I get one that's good for 3 months, but they're all different 3-month periods.
Oh, wow.
In other words, we're just not going to go. And the other problem was you couldn't put down you were going to do Christian mission work because at the time there was a war between Pakistan and neighboring country. So it was very unsettled.
Right.
And that contributed to, I think, the result of our. So I ended up in a small country church in Ohioville Borough, which is very close to Ohio state line, and it was like, as my wife said, you were dragged and chained and went into the church screaming because you didn't want to be there.
Right.
Oh, I was there about a month, and I loved it. I just loved it. I can't explain it, except I landed where God wanted me at the time, and didn't realize it until I was there. And the part of the problem was that everyone there was both worked in the mill and in Midland, and they also farmed. And so no one, they came to church, but there was no time for anything else. So they didn't have anything they needed. Every once in a while somebody would go to the hospital and I'd go visit them. But so basically I could go from week to week and do nothing. And as long as I was there Sunday morning, it seemed like I was fine, except I came out of Pittsburgh where I was racing for the last 8 to 9 years of my life. And there was nothing to race for in a small country church, where the most exciting thing that would happen would be that the man who had cows on his farm forgot on a Easter Sunday to lock the gate, and the cows were walking through the church cemetery. And everybody got upset and excited about that.
Right.
But my wife and I never forgot that vision,
Yeah.
But so it was. So I was able to develop some ministry there and help organize some things. And they hadn't had full-time pastor for quite a number of years. And so it was a formative time. It was a time, of just learning what a pastor needs to learn.
Right.
So that was that part of my life. 5 years there, and I was blessed in many ways.
Now, there's one moment. So there's kind of there's a part of it that I kind of want to make a differentiation about. Now, was it what necessarily came first when you started to kind of shift or have thoughts about the Orthodox Church? Was it an education about the Orthodox Church, or was it you first having maybe second thoughts about Protestantism that kind of led you away from it and into Orthodoxy?
Okay, that's a fair question. Well, let me say this. I was teaching full-time at Geneva College, but I was still ordained as a Protestant pastor, and there were churches in the area that needed someone on Sunday morning. So I would actually do pulpit supply work on Sundays. But it was give me a minute now. It was in the year 1990 that my wife wanted to become Orthodox. We still had children at home, and she couldn't. She couldn't travel with me each Sunday. I was going different directions and sometimes an hour away. So, it was not fair. And I think at that point, though, she had found her own church, and then not far from home. And then by 1990, though, she had talked to me about becoming Orthodox. Her story was an interesting one, which I could share some, but this is an important time. She became Orthodox on the Feast of the Three Hierarchs in January of 2000. She was chrismated by Father Mark at the time, who today is Bishop Mark, at St. John the Orthodox Church in Beaver Falls. And so over a period of years, she would always be getting books, and she was writing, as we say, writing icons or painting icons. She'd taken a class in it and just loved doing it and was blessed in it. But she would give me different books to read. And this might strike something in you, but the first book she ever gave me, and I don't know how she ended up getting it, was Saint Seraphim of Seraph, his whole story.
That's a little bit of foreshadowing, isn't it?
Yes. And but she would give me different and many things to read, and I would read things, and I would actually use some of the material in my Protestant homilies over time. And but it would be years later, and these stories I'm going to be telling you now about Orthodox, becoming Orthodox and deacon and priest. I don't think anyone's ever gone through it this way.
Right.
But she was out one night, and it was November of the year, and she was out somewhere, and I was having dinner, and I stood up. You know how you stand up to turn around and put your dishes in the sink, and the sink was to my back, and I stood up in our kitchen, and I made a quarter of a turn with my plate and dishes in my hands, and this voice comes and says, "I want to become Orthodox."
Oh, wow.
And I just stood there with the dishes in my hands, like something important just happened, and I don't understand this. It took me a whole month to tell my wife. And I finally, because I thought it was just imagination. I thought it was I thought it was strange. But it never went away. And so a month later in December, I'm laying on the living room floor, and she's sitting on a chair, and I'm looking up at her, and I said, "I've been meaning to tell you something." and I said I had to wait because I didn't know if it was real. And she said, "Oh, you need to go talk with Father John, who is Father John Abdullah in Pittsburgh at the cathedral. You need to go talk to Father John, and to who today is Bishop John,
Right.
and in New England." And so I and he knew me. We had been to his house because we had started going to Guatemala. And my wife went first, and then she came back home in 1 year and said, "You need to go with me next year." So every year we would go when I was finished teaching, and usually in August I was freed up from the church. So we'd go in August. And so we went for a number of years down to the mission down there in the Hogar in Guatemala City. And so we would, but the first trip, I had to take her to his place, and it was the first time I met him. And through that, so we would, I went to see Father John, and he said, "I'm excited." I said, "Okay." I said, "I want to go to the House of Studies and just, I don't want to become Orthodox. None of that. I just want to learn about the church."
Right.
And so I was accepted, and I started, and I was doing the readings and doing the papers, and it was helpful, very helpful. And of course, I had very good teachers there, and I had no desire, inclination, anything about becoming ordained. And so I just, eventually I became Orthodox then.
Right.
And then I started where a number of young men start. I started in the altar as an altar server at one point because we were always shorthanded, and kind of learned the ropes from the older men. And that was the very beginning. If you want to know do you want to hear the next two steps about deacon and priest?
Yeah, sure. Well, yeah, let's go from there.
Okay. Well, it was maybe 2-3 years later, after I become Orthodox, we were at vigil at the Monastery of Holy Transfiguration in Elwood City, and that's about 3 minutes around the bend from our house.
Mm-hmm.
And we would go there, as I used to say, for Vespers, because it was a cheap date, it was, so
Sure.
we'd go. And, but we were at vigil on Saturday evening, and Saturday evening is always vigil there. And it's never a short time. So we're almost 2.5 hours into the vigil, getting near the end. And I mean, I was tired, I was hungry, and my feet hurt.
Mm-hmm.
And I started to lean over to my wife to tell her I need to leave. And instead of that, I started crying. These small, very gentle tears that I had never experienced before in my life. And I'm not one of these people that cries easily. And I cried for 10 minutes because I timed it. And I tried stopping, and I couldn't. Fortunately, we were in the back, and no one was behind us.
Right.
And nobody could see us because it was dark. And my wife couldn't see me really very well. And after 10 minutes, the tears just stopped, totally stopped. And when they stopped, this voice comes and says, "You want to be a deacon?" And I'm thinking, I can't believe this.
Just one after another.
That's right. So I decided to go talk to Father John, again, Bishop John, in Pittsburgh about this. And he says, "I'm excited."
Right.
And so I put in my paperwork, quite detailed paperwork, and your spouse has to sign off with you and all those things, and sent that in, and I got approved to become ordained as a deacon. Well, the strange part of the story, this is kind of an interim step along the way. During the House of Studies, I was, it was an off time from classes, and Bishop, Father John Abdullah, who wasn't a bishop yet, had asked me to come to the Antiochian village because he was meeting with a group of clergy, and he wanted me to present that day on marriage counseling as a topic, which was my field of work and study.
Right.
I was in the field of marriage and family therapy, and eventually got licensed in that work. But so that was my area of teaching and developing the program at Geneva College in the graduate counseling program. So he invited me to come. And somewhere during a break in the day, he said, what do you think about, he gave me a question, what do you think about developing a marital pastoral counseling program for clergy? And I said, well, to be honest with you, I said, I teach in a program 60 credits, 2 years full time that cost a little over $60,000 plus books.
Wow.
And I said, when I think about it, I don't know many clergy who would have interest with married with children who could afford the time, the money, and the energy. But I said, let me think about it. And so he had me come back again for something, and a while later, and so I got to see him again. But sure enough, it was just not many days before I was going back. I woke up in the middle of the night, and I had this vision that was so quick I had to get up and write it down on a little scratch piece of paper, how we could incorporate into the House of Study schedule a program that would run with, 8 courses over 2 years with a practicum experience for the clergy. And I showed it to him. And he said, oh, write this up and send it to the House of Studies. I said, oh, okay. So 30 pages later, I'm thinking, okay, I think I can do this. I write up, I take basically courses that I've taught in marriage and family field, develop it into these terms with the House of Studies on the calendar, and I give all the basic outline for each course, plus the course requirements and the bibliography for each course. So we've got 8 courses, so I need 3 to pages per course, and I send it in. So I get a phone call from I don't know if you know the name, Father Joseph Allen.
Sounds familiar.
Yeah, he was for years the director of the program. He's reposed now, but he was calling me up in the middle of one day, and he said, we approved your proposal, and we'd like you to teach. And I'm thinking, teach? He said, we'd like you to teach, but before you teach, we think you should do a master's degree through the House of Studies, which was after the House of Studies, you had the option to stop or go on and do a master's degree. And I had no thought about doing a master's degree. But then he said, you can use these 30 pages you gave us as the program design and development, which is what we like from our students for a master's degree, and do 20 more pages. And so I did what would be a long 20-page introduction to the program with certain history background, and I was able to think through things I wanted to put on paper for myself from an Orthodox perspective. And so that was accepted. And talking with Father John again, I said, Father John, you could teach 4 of these classes and I could teach 4. He said, I don't want to teach. And I said, well, I don't want to teach. So he ended up teaching 1 and I taught the others. It was one of those experiences you never forget. Well, the reason I tell you this story is the 5 clergy I had in the program initially that Father John and I were teaching in. The 5 clergy I had were in the altar when I was ordained a deacon in Antiochian village. They graduated the night before I was ordained. They went through the graduation with the other students and received their certificates.
Oh, wow.
And the next morning, they were all on the altar with, at the time now, it's Bishop John and myself. And and we have pictures of that. So that was a wonderful experience. And so I was ordained a deacon and then served 5 years at St. John's Church in Beaver Falls.
That's beautiful.
Yeah, so it's, and by the way, the stories I'm telling you, all of them about myself, especially about in the Orthodox faith, I still find it hard to believe. And I don't expect people to believe them. It's kind of like, what's the book and the movie I'm thinking of? Classic book.
I mean, it's an extraordinary story regardless.
The wardrobe, the witch, and the...
Oh, yeah, the Lion, the Witch, the Wardrobe, yeah.
Yeah. You know, it's kind of like something like that, and suddenly you go through a closet door and you don't know where you are and how you got there.
And God, lays out this adventure in front of you, yeah.
Yeah. So that's I became a deacon, and that was a blessing. Right. And which, by the way, and I want to say to you outright, I never wanted to be a priest. I enjoyed so much being a deacon. It was what I had lived in my heart for years. It was so familiar to me. It was going out and being with people and helping where I could and providing things for the church. So it was, just it was very natural for me. Different, yes, from being a Protestant pastor, but yet similar in different ways as being a clergy.
Right.
And, so my heart had been shaped in some ways and for that work. And I just felt right at home with it. And I said, oh, I could do this forever. And I've talked with a lot of priests who would say that. Who would say, I wish I were a deacon again.
I know a lot of deacons who just want to kind of stay where they're at and they really enjoy their position and they feel like that's where they could work the best for God's people. And a lot of people elevate into the priesthood, and that's God's calling for them, but there is a significant number of deacons that enjoy the position they're at and they just kind of continue on through their mission in that position.
Yes, and they do wonderful work. I was so glad just to be able to take part in that and be part of it.
Yeah. Now, talking about everything that happened prior to your life as a priest, what would you say about your work prior to being an Orthodox priest? How did it shape your view of human spirituality and assist you in your life when you eventually did become a priest?
Well, that's a good question, a broad question, but let me respond to it because I lived through this. I told you, don't forget, I never liked school.
Right. Yeah.
And so one of the first assignments I had at Geneva College, and I was only there for a year and a half part-time, was to design a program that would be part of the a track that would be called Marriage and Family Counseling.
Okay.
It was one of 3 tracks. To compare them, they had school counseling, they had mental health counseling, and the head of the program was told in a meeting with some of the Christian schools, you need to have a marriage and family program and find someone that's been trained in that to develop that for your program. And he happened to be a good friend of mine and a pastor himself and a psychologist who was the head of the graduate program at Geneva College. And he took me out and my wife to dinner. We would go out every so often, and we were riding down the river to a restaurant, and he hollered back and he said, "What do you think about teaching?" And I present together. My wife was a childbirth educator and knew an awful lot about not only the experience of, as we had our own 5 children, but having taught childbirth classes and assisting in delivery of children and so forth. Her dream was to become a midwife one day, but she never finished training in that.
Sure.
But so they would go out and she would talk about the young developmental stages of newborn and beyond, and he would talk about children and teens. So they would always be out on the road together, going to mainly churches for presentations. And so I tapped her in the knee and I said, "He's talking to you." And she said, "No, he's talking to you." I said, "Who are you talking to?" And he said, "I'm talking to you. What do you think about teaching?" And I said, "What do I think about teaching? I think you're crazy." I said, "Didn't you ever know I don't like school?"
Join the club.
So he said, well, why don't you? Now this is 1990. Okay.
Yeah.
I think. Yeah, 1990, 91. Because that's when I started. But I had a year and a half to do the work now I'm going to tell you about. And that was I was still finishing up my own schooling. I was taking some classes to the Pittsburgh Pastoral Institute for the requirements I needed, because eventually I would get credentialed in the field, but I needed things like professional ethics. I needed, can't remember the other courses, but I needed to take certain coursework and outlined by the state and so forth, and by my own, the American Association for Marriage and Family Therapy. So I had to fulfill requirements. And so I was still in school, but at the same time, I'm designing this program. I'm taking all the classes I'd ever taken and designing a program for Geneva College that would be about, trying to remember, I think 6 classes that I would be teaching.
Mm-hmm.
And so I submitted it, and they accepted it with this footnote that we want you to come and teach, but we can't afford to have you full time yet. So if you want to begin, so I'm teaching between 1990 and 92 classes. And this is one of 5 part-time jobs. And I left the church full-time in 1989. And I'm now living with 5 children, 1 getting ready to go to college, and 5 jobs and no benefits. And
so
my wife
said, "There's a lot
going
going on at that time."
That's right. My wife said it'll be okay. I said, "Oh, okay." Well, we had a Christian doctor that we knew who treated clergy and clergy families for free. So,
well, that's helpful.
I only had to go to him once when I had an infected groin, and he gave me a shot, and I was walking the next day. So I'm always grateful. But they never charged us, and we took our kids there, and so we recovered that way. And I was scraping up enough money from 5 jobs to get through, and then. So I began teaching in 1992 at the college, and basically in the program that I had worked on. And that, that's kind of the background to how I, and by the way, I was drawn to study in this field. It was something I wanted to do.
Right.
And my one graduate degree came out of Fuller Seminary, and it was in the marriage and family field. And I had excellent teachers there. I think that was probably the first inspiration I had about people who were teachers, was the combination of the field and the ability of the teacher who I felt connected to. So I was in a very important way inspired, from them. But I still wasn't back when I was in school, I wasn't prepared at all to teach and had no desire to teach.
Right.
So now, and actually, when I started teaching, I spent 2 weeks and I lost my voice because no one told me I could show videos in the class.
So you were just vocalizing everything.
That's right, and I'm teaching 3-hour classes at a time.
Mm-hmm.
All right, with a break in the middle. And our program was going on a retreat, Christian retreat, and I was going to announce that I needed to quit when I went, and I didn't get the courage, and I came back, and suddenly things began to change, and I actually began to think that I knew a little bit more than the graduate students,
Right.
and it just became better and better for me, and I thoroughly enjoyed. The only time I missed a class in, I forget how many years, 22 years or something. The only time I missed a class was the night it snowed a lot. And I'm down in my classroom.
Right.
And the security person came by, seeing the lights on, and said, "Didn't you get word that the college is closed tonight?" And so I didn't teach that night, but I was so disappointed. I just loved teaching, but never knew that. I just never, until you cross over and do something, you just don't know. And it was like being a pastor. It was like being a teacher, and I just thought it was wonderful.
And it caught
So
you by surprise that you eventually, fell in love with something you thought you'd never want to do.
That's right, yeah. So I enjoyed it all. And so when, and these things began to shape me in confidence and conviction and so forth. And I really began to see and know the importance of both marriage and of families. And I had really good supervisors along the way who were very helpful to me in different programs. So that makes a difference too. And but probably the most important factor in all this is probably my wife. If you remember the book, Everything I Learned in Kindergarten. Do you remember that title?
I'm not familiar with it, no.
It's an older book, but the one I want to write is Everything I Learned About Marriage, I Learned from My Wife.
That's how it goes sometimes, yeah.
But I haven't gotten the time to work on it yet. I've lived it, but I haven't worked on it. But she has been wonderful, and she has a gift of discernment that I've never had until I was ordained. To be honest, she was always giving me cautions and giving me help and support.
Right.
And so all these things were shaping me, and all of it then. And when she became Orthodox, it wasn't like a light came on in me, because I was at a different place and I kept thinking about retirement, what I was going to do. And that was then along that way, even with the readings she gave me and things she would share with me about her experience in Orthodox Church, I was moving in that direction without really realizing it at the time. And so, like I said, then I went through all the other things, became a deacon. So these things were gradually developing that would help me to be Orthodox in heart, in ways that I just never. And by the way, the biases I had, to me, Mary was somebody in the Protestant church you bring out once a year. Because she is the mother of Jesus,
right.
And he's born through her. But otherwise, what else does she do? So I had these biases that there was no way I'd get past it, But when I became Orthodox, those biases all went away. It didn't matter what they were; they just dissipated. And I need to say that because I don't know if I could become Orthodox and still have those biases. I don't think it would make sense to me.
Of course.
And the other thing is, there's a lot, as you know, I think, and many know, that in Orthodoxy doesn't make sense. It's not a rational explanation.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, if somebody could explain to me the Eucharist in rational terms, I'd be grateful. But that's why they call these things mysteries in the church, translated as sacraments. We don't understand them. They're designed to be received. And once I learned that, and by the way, I have to tell you this quick story about receiving. It has become one of my favorite words.
Of course.
When I was reading for the House of Studies in my first year, and I couldn't get where I needed to be in comprehension. I couldn't get where I needed to be in understanding. And it was a winter time, and I was in our dining room because it was very bright and it had snowed. And I looked up from my book, and something struck me strange. And I came up with this saying at that moment that theology, which was what I was reading, theology is not something to be sought. It's something to be received.
Mm-hmm.
And in the Protestant and even Western tradition, it's something that you seek and you carve out and you design and you adhere to. But in the Orthodox faith, it's something to be received. And once I understood that concept, I was with Father Hopko once. He had asked me to go visit with him. Somebody that was, yes.
Mm-hmm.
He was living near the monastery back in those days, and he and I, be able to get to know one another, and so he asked me to visit somebody one day, and we went to visit, and it was a priest and his wife, and she was pretty much incapacitated, and so the priest asked me when he found out I was in the House of Studies, well, what have you learned so far? I said, well, I learned that theology isn't something that you seek, it's something to be received. And Father Hopko spoke right up and said, well, it sounds pretty good to me. And I felt like I just passed a course somewhere,
Yeah, that would count for it, but,
Yeah, so, go ahead.
Well, I was going to ask, all these things that, you did prior to the priesthood, your work in the education and academic fields, I'm sure that a lot of what you learned in marriage counseling kind of helped you in your own marriage, but have you seen it being useful in your life as a priest and working with people and helping them with their marriages in your pastoral life here in the Orthodox Church?
Yes. I mean, what I knew, what I learned, gave me a foundation. But but I think the thing that helped me was the master's thesis I did, which had 30 pages of program work. The 20 pages were really Orthodox Christian anthropology, meaning of the human person, Orthodox understanding of Orthodox marriage, and understanding of the Orthodox family. And I wanted to think through those three areas. And so it was in that writing that really my thinking actually solidified into, I think, the answer to part of your question, that of being able to be present with couples and families, individuals, people who were dying, and having a different understanding, in my words, in the fullness of the faith. It wasn't that I was no longer a Protestant Christian. It was that I was still a Christian in the fullness of the faith. And that fullness really comes, I think, from the change of heart, the throwing out the biases, and the looking at people and marriage and families through a lens of Orthodox understanding. And, so you read St. John Chrysostom on marriage, and others on marriage, or some people about families, and you begin to when you go and visit, when you take part together, even in serving liturgy, you're thinking of the people differently.
Right.
In that sense.
So, considering all that, finding yourself moving away from Protestantism, and then because eventually of your wife finding yourself in the Orthodox Church, what message do you have for Protestants that may feel alienated by whatever denomination they belong to and don't know anything about the Orthodox Church yet?
Well, I use a phrase that so many people have used, which is "come and see."
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. I often read Father Hopko's 55 Maxims, and one of them is don't try to convince anyone of anything.
Right.
And I've learned not to. If anything, I share my story, the stories I'm sharing with you, because they happen to me, and it doesn't mean it's going to happen that way for anybody else in the world. I'd love to meet that person if it does, because we would be close friends for a long time. But but yeah, I would say come and see. I'd invite them to any service. I wouldn't start with Pascha.
That's a little intense for the first time.
I'm not even sure I start with liturgy, although we have some folks visiting right now who have started by coming to liturgy, mm-hmm. which I think is wonderful. I think it's people who are in that category you just mentioned, having gone through something and looking for something. And so, but what I find is it's so many of the churches that seem to be growing and drawing people. It is. I'd love to interview those people who've come and what moved them to come, because it's as I talk with the priests in those churches, I find out that it's the Holy Spirit that is at work there, and not just a poor experience in a church somewhere or over and over poor experience, but a desire to. And, the best way I could say it is the way the church says it is the fullness of the faith. It's different from other denominations, jurisdictions, I should say. But it is the fullness of the faith, which the problem is you don't grasp that at all until you're on the other side of that door.
Yeah.
I don't even think you can grasp it just coming to services. And I mean, there is something about, as I was chrismated and what happens after that. There's something about, I'm not asking people to become deacons, but becoming a deacon, ordained a priest, and what happens after that. There's a greater insight. There's a greater love. There's a deeper a depth in heart of faith that has never been there before. Right. And it's something you don't want to let go of. You want to keep that. And it's I went argue with people. I'd answer people's questions as I have, but I usually talk about myself, which usually I do not except at times when I think it's helpful to answer a question. Mm-hmm. Because I don't have a textbook answer. I could point them to a church father who says this, but even then, they might not even grasp what they're reading, and so I just try to meet them where they are and share with them something that they've not experienced, perhaps, and right. Have them come to the church. Which means we need in the church be prepared for visitors at any time. And as it says in the New Testament, be prepared to make a defense of your faith. But I think one way to do that is sharing a story or two about how you ended up here. By the way, that is my favorite experience is when I used to, still at our home parish in Beaver Falls, when we have someone come to the door, I said, "How did you find us?" is what I ask. Right. And then they will either tell me a name of somebody that they knew that sent them, or, well, I found it on the website and found you were open. Mm-hmm. And, they just, they sometimes just pop in. And I I mean, we're a very small church, but every once in a while that happens. And I love to hear their stories. I think that's because that's their story. And sometimes I'll ask something about mine like you are, and I don't go on as long with them, but I like to share some of it.
Right.
But my wife's story began when she was on her way home from a basketball game, Christian school against Christian school, coming home from Portersville to her home in New Brighton, PA. And for many weeks would drive past this monastery, and one day decided to drive up the hill. And she got to the door, and she hated to knock or ring the doorbell because she was afraid she'd wake up a monk.
Right.
And so she quietly knocks at the door. And actually, she opens the door and she goes in, I think, without even knocking. And one of the mothers comes around the bend, around the corner, and is standing there. And she says, "Oh, you're a nun." And she said, "Yes, I am." She was looking for a monk, you know.
That's really funny.
And so this mother would introduce her to others and say, "This is Pat. She just drove up the driveway." It was like that was her last name. So every time they'd introduce her, "This is Pat, and she just drove up the driveway."
Yeah.
As her last name, yeah. So I mean, what's the chances, you know, and the timing, and you know, she'll share that story when people ask, "Well, how did you get here?" You know, in this church, you know. So it's just, and I think everyone's story is very different that way, and it's someone should do a book like in every parish about the last 20 people that have come in, and just their stories. And write that. I think that thing would sell well in any parish, and you really get to know people, you know.
I agree.
And that could be your next project, by the way.
Yeah, maybe after I get through the list of the next 50 priests I gotta interview. After that, we'll work on that, God willingly.
Okay, good.
So, you know, all of these things that you've been through, you know, whether they've been challenging or positive or whatever the case may be, in your life as a priest, what would you say is the proudest moment of your ministry?
Yeah, I'm sorry, is the what?
Is the proudest moment of your ministry?
Oh. I think the beginning. Mm-hmm. This is the part you didn't hear. You should have asked me how I became a priest. You heard how I became a deacon.
You were covering a lot of it. I was like, oh, okay, I hope I don't make him repeat anything, but...
No, you're not. No, but how I became a priest. So I'm a deacon 5 years, right?
Right.
And a deacon goes out to do the Great Litany in the service, in liturgy. I'm standing in front of the icon of Christ, and I start with the first line. I get out the first two names, and this is on Palm Sunday, 5 years after I'm a deacon. And I start crying. And I knew at the count of two what it was. I knew I was going to become a priest. I knew that's what this was. And what was different was I cried through the entire liturgy. Now, remember, I'm not a person who cries easily.
Right.
So I'm so grateful my back's to the people. And I'm so grateful that the priest is busy reading things when I go up in the altar to get his blessing, you know, to go back out. So my head's down and he blesses me and I go out. And so no one sees me crying. All right. But I'm crying through the whole service, trying to wipe my eyes so I can see what I'm reading and praying. And at the end of liturgy, but the thing that surprised me, actually shocked me, was how could I be crying like this for almost an hour and a half and be at great peace? I couldn't understand that at all. So after the liturgy, I just want to stay in the altar for the next 2 weeks. I just want to live there. I've never had such great peace. And I don't understand it, other than I know I have to become a priest somehow. So I said, I better go downstairs. My wife's waiting on me at coffee hour. So I go down the steps, and instead of going over to see her, she sees me coming through the door. I go over and I start visiting with a little baby. because I couldn't face people. I just couldn't do it. So I go over and I sit down next to her, and she says, "How was your morning?" And I said, "I'll tell you on the way home," because I don't have the time right now.
Right.
Because usually I'll go down the steps as a deacon, and I'm carrying the bread bowls, I'm carrying this and doing this and running around and doing all these things in the kitchen, And I didn't do that day. And so on the way home, I tell her what happens, and she said to me, "When you came down the steps and came through the doorway, I looked at your face," and she said, "It was glowing."
Wow.
Now, I don't know that. I just know that I've never had such peace in my life. Now, here's what's strange. Even though I've done many mistakes in the altar, you can ask any priest I've served with, including Father
I'm right
Hucker.
with you, don't worry.
All right. But I have never been in a service in the altar as a priest and not have been at peace, ever.
Mm-hmm.
And that is, like, for me, so unusual, because I become OCD even if I'm not in a liturgy when I'm serving. But even when I was learning, and I said, "Oh, I'll never get this to where I can worship." I didn't feel like I could worship, but I felt like I was at peace. It took me 6 months to feel like I could really worship, because you're always thinking about what's next and what do I have to do, what I forget, all these things. But I was always at peace, and that is something that's never left me. I hope it never does. It's just wonderful.
Right.
And my wife will say, if she's there at church, wherever I am, she'll say, "It was so peaceful in church today." And I never remind her of this,
It's like, how do you think I feel, huh? Yeah.
It's not my fault. It's not me. It's just, it's amazing to me. And I'm not that kind of person. I've lived on the edge of my life forever about making mistakes and I hate making mistakes, by the way, but it's like, and it finally, this is I think my saint Seraphim has helped me with this part. That piece from the altar has translated finally into my life,
Mm-hmm.
my general life, really. And when I begin to feel like I'm losing that peace, I just ask the Lord, bring me back to my peace. Because I do it right away. I don't wait. So it's kind of like, you go through all these, like, terrible, difficult things or whatever, and I just say, bring me back to my peace. So I've learned to really, from the altar, translate that. When in liturgy, we really are preparing ourselves to go back into the world. And we're equipped now because we receive the body and blood of Christ and the blessing of the priest, and sometimes with confession before that. So we're prepared to go out the doors into the world again. And so I think of it that way for myself, that I need to carry this peace from the altar to be with me. And so that really helps.
And it's funny that we're talking about that, because the most famous quote from the saint you took the name from is "Acquire the spirit of peace, and 1,000 souls around you will be saved." You connect with him on that level.
Yes, and by the way, when that happened to me, I began to understand that sentence. It took me some time, because I was trying to figure out how that happens or how that works. I still don't. And I have to accept and receive that I don't understand it. It's just, it happens, but it doesn't happen. It's the Holy Spirit. It's not us.
Yeah.
And once you get that, you've got it.
The best way I've always described, like, stuff like that to people, at least that I could muster up, is, if you ever see the one icon of the Theotokos inside of the fountain with Christ in her lap, and she's in the fountain, and people people put their pitchers into the water and they're taking from it. It's like, that fountain of grace is what a lot of the saints and even ordinary people that you meet in your life, whether they be priests or laymen or whatever, can have the grace of the Holy Spirit bleed off them onto you and have a profound impact on your life. It's really cool how it works.
Yes, it is. Yes.
Yeah. And, I was going to ask about who your favorite saint was and what about their life makes them special to you, but I'm assuming it's Saint Seraphim of Seraph.
Oh yeah, that's it. And oh, by the way, when I read the book, 1990 was the year. My wife gave it to me. I read it, and at the end, I took my time. I read it, and I laid it down. I said, "Oh, I could never be like that." Is what I said. And this was many years before I would become Orthodox. So it's. But after that, and by the way, every year I try to go back somewhere during Lent and other times and read sections. I've marked sections, and things that I maybe have forgotten, but that's certainly the quote that I never forget. But I like to reread sections that sometimes you don't recall so well, and so I enjoy doing that.
Right. And there's kind of this trend, surrounding, different denominations of Christians. You just spent a lot of time telling us about how you found this peace in Orthodoxy, and you found this peace being a priest. And, I feel like that puts us in a particularly unique position where, even though we are academic and scholastic in ways, we're also participants of the mystical world. We're participants of the unseen warfare and of God's divine energies, interacting with us. So I feel like that almost makes us, coming from a different place in certain conversations. So, as of now, at least in the church, you see a lot of Protestants or Catholics arguing with each other, or you have like Orthodox arguing with Catholics, Orthodox arguing with Protestants. But, I wanted to ask you, since you come from one side coming over to the other, what do you think the right move is to make when confronted from other Christians of other denominations in a debate against our faith? How should people respond to those situations?
Yeah, that is a very good question, and a tough question in some ways. And you gave part of the answer when you said, we're part of a mystical church where there's so much that we understand and much more we do not understand. And part of that, this phrase is true in the Western church, that the church is visible and invisible. I mean, that was said in the early church by... I'm trying to remember. I don't want to quote which saint, but one of the saints. But it's in the writings. But it's also true in the Western Church. But I think it's the invisible part and the part that's unknown. And we use the word. we use these terms, or the term mystical. The mystical church. I don't. The downside is I don't of that for the Western person Christian is that they're not going to have the same reference for that as Orthodox do.
Right.
They would understand. They understand the word mystery, but they wouldn't understand it in the same word. I mean, St. Paul uses the word in Ephesians. Well, he says, all this is a mystery, and that word is used as the word sacrament in the Western Church as well, and we use it as the word sacrament. But it's, but I don't know how that person would grasp that idea of what we're talking about right now, the mystical church and the mystical supper. Because the Western Christian has translated that into a rational mind, and I would think a certain rational heart that makes sense to them.
Right.
And I think this is not how we would do it. It actually, these things come into and out of our heart, and the spiritual heart is what I'm referring to now. Mm-hmm. And I think that process is so different. So how to respond, to get back to your specific question, how to respond to that person, I don't, all we could do is and I go back to the verse about, always be ready to defend your faith and so on, but defend it in terms of what you believe and how you believe it, whatever the topic, whether it's about the mystical church or the mystical supper. And some of the things I said today, like, I don't understand this, and this. And, and people could hear my stories, but they could not understand them. Right. And the reason why I think they could not is because I don't understand them. And I mean that sincerely. I can't put it into rational words what happened. I can't put into rational words what happens, the changes in me when I partake of the Eucharist. I just know something changes. And something has changed over time. But and I've talked about this in public in churches, that I can't understand what has happened to me. And I should be able to, but I just can't put it into words. So I think, and that's difficult when you're trying to communicate with someone in an English language with English words, something that has happened. It's, and the best someone could say is, well, boy, that's some story, but I've never had that experience. And I say, well, I understand.
Click. Yeah.
Yeah. So I wish I could say more about the answer to what you're saying, but I think, though, again, sharing our stories with those who are visiting in the church, those who have never or read about, been part of, I think we simply have to share once in a while our stories of the faith, that how we came here.
Right.
How we ended up here, which is what I've tried to do today. And I appreciate all your questions you've asked too. It's helped me to relive, and it's kind of like, so I could end with a comment, I believe it helped my unbelief,
Yeah, exactly.
That verse makes more sense to me today than ever,
Mm-hmm. I know exactly what you mean.
I'm not sure it's the right context, but for me, the wording makes sense,
Mm-hmm. Do we still have a little time, or do you have to get going?
I have to finish up very soon. If you have something else you want to end on, or you go ahead.
Yeah, I guess the only other thing I wanted to ask is, when I was at my time in Geneva, I've been an Orthodox Christian since the very beginning of my life, so I've never really stepped outside of it. But going and being around Protestants, I noticed some things that, at least to me, were positive behaviors and habits that Orthodox Christians can learn from. Like, the Protestant friends that I have memorized Scripture and know more about the geographical and historical, I guess, happenings of the Old Testament Jews and stuff like that. But considering that you were actually Protestant for a large swath of your life, what would you say are some applicable habits that Orthodox Christians can learn from Protestants that we could learn from them, perhaps?
Well, you mentioned one or two. I think certainly the reading of Scripture, which we have found that the people across the country are biblically illiterate.
Yeah.
And it doesn't matter what church. It doesn't matter what church. It doesn't matter where people came from. I'm talking about in the research done, by I forget the group that does all that research. Nobody spends enough time in the Bible other than those very strongly committed Protestant folks and strongly committed Orthodox and Catholic folks that really want to learn from the Bible. But I think, I could mention things that we do approach differently, like prayer. Some prayers are the same, like the Lord's Prayer, but the context, is often different when we use it and how we use it, as in liturgy and services, funeral services. So it's a good question. I think if you see someone that has discipline, I think what goes into their discipline would be a good question,
Right.
and know how that is. We have our own rules of prayer and discipline in the Orthodox faith, but sometimes you get ideas from Protestants.
Yeah, I agree. Well, Father, I mean, I am shocked and pleased and all these things about the stories that you've told us. You've had a lot of experiences in your life that I think a lot of people are going to be able to extract something spiritually beneficial from, and I thank you for coming on and talking to us for almost an hour and a half now. I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Oh, you're very welcome. Thank you for your work, and God bless it all.
Yeah, thank you so much, Father. And we are going to be on tomorrow with Father Philip Contos. So hopefully I'll have this episode up soon. And for all of you listening, Panagia Mazisu, God bless you all, and we will talk to you guys again soon. Thank you.
Amen.
Απολύας φύση ο Θείος μου Υιός Σιγάρ κατάγγισε όλος τη αμαρτία Και παρεδόθης τελείως τη ραφημία Της εξαναστήσης εκείμενο
Kyrie Iisus Christe eleison, 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 Kyrie Iisus Christe eleison.